For more than 2 decades, Juanita Bynum said nothing. She watched headlines come and go, platforms rise and fall, and one man's influence grow larger than the church itself. But at 63, silence was no longer an option. When Bishop T.D. Jakes stepped away from leadership, Juanita Bynum didn't react with shock or celebration. She reacted with clarity. And what she revealed wasn't about one resignation, but about a system, a pressure, and a truth that had been building for years. The moment that changed everything. To understand why Juanita Bynum's words matter now, you have to go back to a moment that altered the trajectory of modern church culture. In the late 1990s, Juanita Bynum was not yet a household name. She had survived years of personal collapse, a failed marriage, anorexia, welfare lines, institutionalization, and a suicide attempt, before slowly rebuilding her life through work, faith, and discipline. By the mid-1990s, she had returned to ministry in New York under Pastor John Boyd, preaching with intensity but far from the national spotlight. That changed when Bishop T.D. Jakes invited her to attend his Woman, Thou Art Loosed gathering. At the time, Jakes was already becoming one of the most powerful figures in American Christianity, known for his commanding sermons, organizational discipline, and ability to build platforms that reached tens of thousands. Juanita initially arrived as a participant, not a headliner, but within a short span, she moved from the audience to the stage. When she delivered the sermon that would later be known as No More Sheets, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. She spoke openly about sexuality, shame, emotional fragmentation, and the spiritual cost of intimacy without healing. These were topics rarely addressed so directly by women in church spaces, especially before crowds of that size. The message resonated because it was not theoretical. It was lived experience. Thousands stood, cried, and responded as if something unspoken had finally been named. The sermon spread far beyond the conference walls. Recordings circulated across the country and internationally, reaching women who had never set foot in a megachurch. Within a few years, Juanita Bynum became one of the most recognizable female voices in Christian media. Her books topped bestseller lists, her gospel album achieved platinum status, and her appearances on faith-based networks were constant. All of it began on T.D. Jakes' platform. To the public, their partnership looked like unity, a visionary bishop and a fearless preacher working in harmony to transform lives. But behind the scenes, the dynamics were already more complicated. Because as Juanita's influence grew, so did questions about control, accountability, image, and who ultimately decides what truth is allowed to sound like from the pulpit. The quiet fracture behind the platform. As Juanita Bynum's voice grew louder, something else began to change quietly behind the scenes. Publicly, she was celebrated as a trailblazer, a woman who spoke with authority, vulnerability, and fire. Privately, the expectations around her tightened. She was no longer just a preacher. She had become a symbol, and symbols are rarely allowed to be complicated. Within Pentecostal and charismatic church culture, spiritual authority operates through an unwritten but powerful structure. Mentorship is not only relational, it is hierarchical. Leaders are expected to remain under covering, to submit to counsel, and to protect the unity and image of the ministry that elevated them. For years, Juanita had benefited from that system. But as her success accelerated, so did her resistance to it. Those close to the situation later described growing tension between Juanita and Bishop T.D. Jakes over direction, autonomy, and accountability. Juanita was outspoken by nature. She believed truth should be spoken plainly, even when uncomfortable. Jakes, on the other hand, was building something far larger than a single sermon or speaker. His ministry was expanding into a global operation where discretion, consistency, and control mattered as much as spiritual impact. The conflict was not aired publicly. There were no interviews, no statements, no dramatic confrontations for the audience to dissect. Instead, it played out in meetings, conversations, and counsel that Juanita later admitted she did not receive well. She was riding the momentum of fame, convinced she had earned the right to move independently. From her perspective, she was stepping into her calling. From Jakes's perspective, she was stepping out of order. By the time Woman Thou Art Loosed gathered again in the early 2000s, the fracture was complete. Juanita Bynum's name was no longer on the program. No announcement explained her absence. No farewell acknowledged her contribution. For the thousands who associated her rise with that stage, the silence was confusing. Rumors filled the gap. Some speculated about finances, others about creative differences. But the truth that emerged later was far more personal. In church terms, Juanita had rebelled against spiritual covering. That label carried serious consequences. It meant not only the loss of a platform, but the loss of protection within the system. When Jakes reportedly made it clear that their ministry relationship was over, it marked a turning point. Juanita went from commanding arenas to rebuilding in smaller, independent spaces. The woman whose voice once shook stadiums now preached without the machinery that had amplified her. Collapse, silence, and the cost of speaking too honestly. Losing a platform is one thing. Losing stability at the same time is something else entirely. After Juanita Bynum disappeared from the stage that launched her, the unraveling accelerated. In the same period her ministry footing weakened, her personal life moved toward a decision that would later define her darkest chapter. She married Bishop Thomas Weeks III in an extravagant nationally televised ceremony that symbolized triumph, restoration, and permanence. The event cost over $1 million and was presented as a declaration that her painful past was finally behind her. But behind the spectacle, the marriage was already unstable. The pressure Juanita carried did not ease after the wedding. If anything, it intensified. She was now expected to represent spiritual victory while privately struggling with emotional exhaustion, unresolved trauma, and the sudden loss of institutional protection she once had. Without the same covering, every decision carried greater risk. Every mistake cost more. By the time the marriage collapsed, the fallout was brutal and public. In an Atlanta hotel parking lot, Juanita Bynum was assaulted by her husband in an incident that left her injured and hospitalized. The details shocked the Christian world. This was not a private dispute hidden behind closed doors. It was violence that could not be explained away or quietly managed. For the first time, the woman who had preached healing to millions stood exposed as a victim. Juanita did something few expected. She spoke. She refused to spiritualize abuse or excuse it as marital conflict. She described how emotional and verbal control often precede physical violence, and how silence inside the church enables harm. Her honesty was devastating and costly. As she processed the trauma publicly, many anticipated that the leaders who once elevated her would step forward in support. Instead, there was quiet, no public defense, no visible alignment, no statements that acknowledged the depth of what she endured. For Juanita, that absence was louder than any condemnation. It reinforced a lesson she was beginning to understand. The church often celebrates vulnerability in sermons, but resists it in real life, especially when it disrupts the image of order and success. As she struggled with depression and suicidal thoughts, Juanita also began to interrogate the system that shaped her rise and fall. Her preaching changed. It became more confrontational, less polished, and far less comfortable. She questioned prosperity theology, the way suffering was framed as spiritual failure, and the expectation that leaders bleed privately so institutions can remain clean. She never named names, but those who listened closely understood exactly who and what she was addressing. Celebrity ministry, power, and the business of faith. By the time Juanita Bynum was struggling to rebuild her life and ministry, Bishop T.D. Jakes was no longer operating solely as a pastor. He had become something far larger, a brand architect, a media executive, and a cultural power broker. His influence extended well beyond church walls into publishing, film production, leadership conferences, and global partnerships. Faith was no longer just preached, it was packaged, distributed, and scaled. Jakes's sermons reached millions through television and digital platforms. His books dominated bestseller lists. His leadership summits attracted corporate figures alongside pastors, blending spirituality with executive language. The message was carefully calibrated, inspirational, aspirational, and non-threatening to the systems that supported his growth. It was faith, designed to travel well, to fit comfortably in boardrooms as much as sanctuaries. This evolution created a stark contrast with Juanita Bynum's trajectory. While Jakes moved deeper into institutional protection, Juanita operated without a safety net. She did not have media deals cushioning her mistakes or teams managing public perception. Her ministry relied on direct connection, honorariums, and small-scale gatherings that rose or fell based on reputation. In that environment, transparency became a liability. The difference revealed a harsh reality about modern ministry. Platforms are not neutral. They are controlled. Access is negotiated. And longevity often depends on how well a leader conforms to expectations set by gatekeepers. Jakes understood this world and mastered it. Juanita challenged it, sometimes deliberately, sometimes simply by refusing to hide her wounds. As Juanita spoke more openly about trauma, abuse, and emotional breakdowns, the distance between her and institutional favor widened. Churches grew cautious. Invitations came with conditions or stopped altogether. Her critiques of prosperity theology and image-driven leadership made her uncomfortable to host. She was no longer offering applause lines. She was offering disruption. The imbalance of power became undeniable. Jakes could afford silence. His empire insulated him. Juanita could not. Every sermon she preached was scrutinized. Every emotional moment became evidence against her stability. In a system that rewards composure, her authenticity was interpreted as weakness. This dynamic was not unique to Juanita. Other women in gospel culture experienced similar consequences when they stepped outside approved narratives. They were celebrated when controlled and sidelined when honest. The message was clear, even if unspoken. Truth is acceptable only when it does not threaten the structure. By now, Juanita understood that what happened between her and Jakes was not simply about personality or pride. It was about incompatible visions of leadership. One prioritized expansion, protection, and polish. The other insisted on exposure, accountability, and emotional truth. And when those visions collided, the system chose the one that kept the machine running. Why Juanita spoke when T.D. Jakes stepped down. When Bishop T.D. Jakes announced he was stepping down, the reaction across the Christian world was immediate. Shock, gratitude, speculation. Many framed it as succession planning. Others saw it as a graceful exit after decades of leadership. But Juanita Bynum heard something different. She did not hear surprise. She heard exhaustion. By the time the announcement came, Jakes had already survived a severe health crisis. His body had signaled what his public image never allowed, that carrying an empire comes at a cost no sermon can cancel. For Juanita, this moment was familiar. She had watched the signs years earlier, not from the top of the structure, but from the outside looking in. She had seen what happens when ministry becomes larger than the human being holding it together. When Juanita finally spoke, her words were not framed as accusation. They were framed as understanding. She did not claim insider knowledge. She did not present secret conversations. Instead, she spoke from lived experience. She spoke about burnout that hides behind success, about leadership cultures that reward performance while quietly draining the soul, about the impossible demand placed on spiritual figures to remain flawless while absorbing the needs of thousands. She questioned a system that turns calling into brand, healing into product, and leadership into endurance contests. Her message was clear without being cruel. No one can carry that weight forever, not without losing something essential. This is where many misunderstood her. Some expected praise, others expected condemnation. Juanita offered neither. What she offered was context. She reframed Jakes's exit not as failure, but as consequence. Not moral collapse, but structural strain. She emphasized that when leaders are elevated beyond accountability, surrounded by protection, and denied space to be human, the cost eventually surfaces through health, fatigue, or quiet withdrawal. What this reckoning means for the church. By the time the dust settled around Bishop T.D. Jakes stepping away, one truth became unavoidable. This was not just the end of a leadership era. It was exposure of a system that had gone unquestioned for far too long. Juanita Bynum understood that better than most, because she had already been crushed by it years earlier. Her reflections forced the church to confront uncomfortable realities. What happens when ministries grow faster than the people leading them? What happens when branding replaces accountability and image becomes more valuable than emotional health? Juanita's life offered a painful answer. She had been celebrated when she fit the narrative and abandoned when she no longer did. Her honesty did not protect her. It isolated her. As Jakes transitioned authority to a new generation, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. Leadership was being passed down within structure, protection, and continuity. Juanita's journey had followed the opposite path: fragmentation, exile, and slow reconstruction without institutional shelter. Both paths were shaped by the same system, but only one was designed to survive it. Juanita never denied Jakes's impact. She acknowledged the lives changed, the doors opened, the legacy built. But she also made clear that legacy alone cannot justify a culture that consumes its leaders and discards its wounded. Her message was not about blame. It was about cost. The cost of silence, the cost of control, the cost of demanding perfection from human beings. At 63, Juanita Bynum no longer needed approval from platforms that once defined her worth. Her ministry had shifted from expansion to meaning, from applause to truth. She spoke now because she no longer feared being pushed out. She had already survived that. So what do you think? Was this really just a resignation? Or was it the result of a system that demands too much and listens too little? Do you believe the church is ready to choose authenticity over image? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if this story made you see ministry differently, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more deep stories like this.